we are not making the progress on finance that we would like to see. A lot of developing countries came here to Warsaw in the hope that it really would be not just a quote-unquote implementation COP, but a finance COP, meaning with some concrete commitments to add additional finance to the pot of international climate finance flows. And that obviously stems back from some earlier commitments that are yet unfulfilled, namely that we are trying to scale up financing to the 100 billion by 2020 eventually. We have finished the fast start period, and that's all good and well, although not as much money as should have been was additional. But now we really don't have a plan how to scale up from 2013 to 2020 to actually reach from the roughly 10 billion of public financing for fast start finance to the 100 billion of, from mixed sources that they have committed to reach by 2020. And that's very much a problem. And that, I think, affects everything. That affects the level of trust or the lack of trust that we have in the negotiations. And it also affects the lack of ambition and enthusiasm that you see from developing countryside to actually come forward with emissions reduction goals.
But I mean, there's still time in this conference. We've got the climate finance ministerials tomorrow, so presumably there might be progress there. From people I've spoken to, no one was really expecting there would be any pledges at this conference. Mm-hmm. What could we expect in terms of developing more of a pathway towards working out where the money's coming from? What sort of, I don't know, other concrete steps would you like to see put in place just to help people understand a bit clearer, a bit more clearly how that money could turn out?
Well, I think one thing that I would like to see is definitely a commitment that public finance has to be a large part and the most significant part of the 100 billion commitment. You spoke of the climate, the high-level finance ministerial that is going on tomorrow, and I think there from developed countryside who are organizing that there is a lot of focus on basically the role that private finance is supposed to play, and consequently the role of the public finance in mobilizing climate finance, private climate finance. And while that's obviously a very important goal, I mean, we have to be very mindful that the private sector will not come in and fund a lot of the investments that are needed, particularly, for example, with relation to adaptation, more of the sustainable development context, just because there is no return on investment in those. But I think as the horrible typhoon in the Philippine context has shown, this is actually the kind of investments that need to be taken and need to be taken preventively to then avoid having situations where national economies and national societies are just completely overwhelmed.
Is there too much focus on all these different other bits taking place in the process at the moment and not on the longer term goal, which is this 2015 deal, which obviously then would come in 2020 to kind of develop a climate change agreement? There seems to be all these other different bits going on at the moment, like loss and damage and the finance, and you kind of wonder whether there's really focus on the long-term goal or whether there are too many smaller bits distracting.
I don't think there are smaller bits distracting. That's a part and parcel of the same package. You can't have emissions reductions if you're not also looking at dealing with basically the damage that is already done in countries, giving countries and people an opportunity for a decent life, giving them the technology needs to make that possible, giving them the finance to make that possible. And you have to actually see that as the other side of the coin. You will only have commitments for mitigation and ambitious commitments from all sides, and that has to include developing countries. If you first of all have ambitious commitments from developed countryside, and I think what we're seeing here at the COP at the moment, unfortunately, with a number of developed countries, goes completely in the other direction, and you need to give them the means of implementation. That's a commitment under the convention. Technology is part of it and finance is part of it. So that's not a distraction, but is the essential for having a serious commitment in 2015 for the post-2020 timeframe. And actually we are talking about the implementation of commitments that are already taken. If you're not even doing that, how should parties then take any trust that whatever agreement we are developing by 2015 for a post-2020 framework will be better in sticking to implementation and basically being true to the letter of the convention. And they can't.
Are there enough guarantees and I don't know, regulations to ensure that money that is delivered from richer to poorer countries is used appropriately and is used in a transparent way? Because I guess it's very important for many politicians, particularly of what we call, the developed countries, to be able to go back to their electorates and say that the money is being used in an appropriate way. It's whether or not we agree with the fact that the money needs to be delivered, it still has to be done in a way which is, I guess, politically tenable.
I think it's a matter, obviously, for the various funds to develop those kind of accountability and transparency mechanisms, their fiduciary principles, their environmental and social safeguards that they apply. Doesn't mean that they can't be, for example, developed even better or more stringent, but I think accountability cuts both ways. Again, I think it's not just the accountability that recipient countries have towards, quote unquote, the contributor countries or donor countries. I hate the word donor countries, I don't want to use donor. Contributor countries, because it's fulfilling an obligation under the convention, but it's also a matter of actually the accountability towards the people on the ground who are the affected people who really are supposed to benefit from the financing. So this is a kind of accountability level too that both the recipient countries' governments have vis-a-vis their people, but that also the developed country governments in terms of delivering the financing that they're supposed to support them. And if I can inject, I know you haven't asked that, but I want to inject it, today is Gender Day. And I think one of the things that is very crucial is that finance as a means of implementation is done in a gender-sensitive way, and that the funds take up the fact that men and women are affected very differently by climate change, and they have different capabilities to contribute to climate change solutions are reflected in climate financing instruments. And the Green Climate Fund is a very good one. A lot of the talks here have actually focused on the Green Climate Fund. A lot of hopes have been put into the Green Climate Fund. Now, the Green Climate Fund is supposed to contribute to a paradigm shift, be transformational, do things very differently than other funds have done in the past. And it has a mandate to do its funding in a gender-sensitive approach. This is part and parcel of a transformational, paradigmatic view on change of how to do financing. And I think, again, we are talking here about what we need to do differently and better to ensure that both men and women equitably profit on the ground, profit from climate financing instrument. So I think it would be upon all parties, here the COP, which gives guidance to the Green Climate Fund, but the Green Climate Fund board members to make sure that the fund is implemented in a gender-sensitive way, considers different needs of men and women and different contributions of men and women when agreeing or deciding on projects and programs for implementation.